Hello and welcome to today's live stream. We are so excited to have you on this overcast, rainy Monday morning. But what is not overcast is the awesomeness that is Christopher Gilbert sharing with us a little bit about composition and landscape photography. Looks like we already have over 10 people in here with us. That is awesome. I need you guys to let me know where you're joining from, and I'll throw your name up on the screen. If you can't tell, we are so excited. Maybe not for the presentation, but this warm-up music. This is some good uplifting tunes. Who's ready to go today? Hello and welcome. Quick double check, okay? Coast is clear. Now, if a customer comes in, I'm gonna put that right back on. But I wanted you to see my beautiful face, and I wish I could see your face in the store. We are open, which is exciting, and I want to welcome you guys to our virtual hangouts that we do every day at noon, every weekday at noon, where we try to teach you just a little bit of something, whether it's landscapes, whether it's video, whether it's different lenses, we've done one on audio. We're trying to educate and share knowledge with you during the kind of the stay at home, the social distancing order. So today we're actually going to be talking a little bit about landscape photography and composition in general. So it looks like there are some new people here though. So I do want to say hello to them. And Chris, I think Chris is actually kind of in the wings, if you will. But he's going to actually do a little review of a couple of the high points from the last presentation that he did, which was super well received, and then jump into composition since there's a couple new faces. So let's see who we have here. Jen Stitt says hello. Hello, Jen. Hope you're doing well. Don Rogers, Ball State University. Go Cards. Joey Campana, Chris's last class was epic. That it was.
Thank you so much.
Chuck says, what's up, photogs? We are too extreme. Absolutely. David says hello from Twinsburg. Hello, hello. Les says hello. Hi, Les. Hope you're doing well as well. And then rounding it out, Glenna. Hello, Glenna. I hope you are doing well on this overcast day here in the Cleveland area. So it looks like we have over 20 people in here. So I'm going to hand it over to my friend Chris. How are we doing today, sir?
Always doing good, my friends. Always doing good. It is overcast, but it's still...
I'm sorry? Doesn't that music just get you going? I love it.
Every single time. If you guys couldn't see it in the broadcast room, we were just rocking out. That's how I get my exercise. At least I get 5 minutes every single day when that song comes out.
I love it. So let's break it down. What are we going to be talking about today?
So I did a class about 2 weeks ago. We're, like you mentioned beforehand, we're going to do about a 10-minute summary of that class. It's going to be really fast for those of you who missed the 2-week class. Then we're going to go into composition in terms of multiple aspects of it, layering images, leading lines, all that kind of jazz. Obviously, I'll go more in depth than just that, but we'll talk about, what lenses to use in order to get a certain look and kind of the experiences that I had using said lenses, what worked for me, what didn't work for me, what should I do if I'm using one lens versus another one. So that's kind of the general overview in terms of just the composition portion of the landscape class.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get your screen shared here, and then I will follow up at the end with this week's new contest. It's going to be a good one, and I wanted to once again say congrats to last week's contest winner. I think he ordered a Tether Tools rolling stand, so
nice.
Get that in here for the store for him to up his food photography game. So let's see if we can get your screen on there.
Hey, I'm official.
Looks good. It looks like we're seeing the slides. We're full stream. It's all you, buddy.
Perfect. So for the people that were not here, my name is Christopher Gilbert. I'm a visual artist and I teach photography for a living for Fujifilm. So I've been with them for 2 years now. Been a photographer for about 20. So my job is basically just to travel the US. I cover mainly the Midwest. I'll teach, our cameras, our being Fujifilm. In terms of how to use, recommendations. Beyond that, my real bread and butter is landscapes. I sold images for quite a while, and I moved away from that because I found this to be more empowering than the sales side of things. I worked at a camera store for about 8 years before this, so basically for the last 15 years, I've been on both sides of the counter, education, sales, as well as a photographer in general. The reason why I made that move, like I said before, just teaching has been kind of my thing. So like I said, we're going to be covering just the key points of the last presentation. So basically just equipment-wise, I have 2 sets. I have a big print set and a hiking set. My big print set is going to be GFX 50S with these 3 lenses, 51 megapixels, medium format camera. Next, I have 2 landscape kits. I have basically this one that has zoom lenses in there. XT4 is brand new. It's roughly 1 week out now. And these 3 lenses cover anywhere from 10 millimeters up to 200 millimeters. And this is basically my lightweight kit in comparison to the other one. As we all know, sensor size dictates lens size. So for me, It's an APS-C sensor. My lenses can be very small. So, I can shave off half the weight, if not more so, comparative to my big print kit. Next, I've been a Leica shooter for a little while now, definitely a film shooter. So I have 5 M-mount lenses that I like to use, especially with the X-T4. I mean, this is a very specialized camera, in-body image stabilization. With all the focal lengths I have right here, I have almost 6.5 stops on some of them. It's not really measurable, but, at least comparative to the lenses that we have in terms of XF lenses, focal lengths up to about maybe 80 millimeters or so are generally 6.5 stops. The main reason why I use these are the lenses that I fell in love with when I shot film and Leica digital. So using on the X-T4, I get the characteristics that I like from these lenses with the film simulations that I want. Because we'll talk about a lot of the stuff that I do and a lot of stuff that you see will be JPEGs out of camera, and that's mainly just to show you what the camera can do, rather than what I can do in Photoshop, since I roughly have about 20 years in it. So the filter set that I use, Nisi filter set. I'm actually talking with Pixel Connection about getting another one. Nisi is my preferred brand in terms of a holder, mainly because their circular polarizer is built into the actual adapter. So it makes it really easy for me to have one piece of glass rather than two, because general polarizers, you have to have one screw onto the actual lens itself, and there's another one on top that allows me to rotate it. Nisi setup, I don't need that. Basically, it's just one piece that I can rotate. These are the 4 filters that I used, and then generally what I use in camera. So 90% of what I do is in camera. I do have 20 years in Photoshop, but for me, I like to be out in the field more so. Tripod, L bracket, this is basically the gear that I use in order to get the best image quality possible, because we all know, if the camera's stationary, my film speed or ISO can drop to the base level, and at that base level, I have my best image quality, my best dynamic range typically. And just for me and my style of shooting, we kind of talked about it last time with one of the shots in terms of showing motion. I like to show motion in my images just because it gives me a sense that I'm there. So I'll play this clip real quick. And so the circular polarizer, if there's only one piece of gear that you get from all of this in terms of the 10 minutes that I'm covering, a circular polarizer is going to give you the most difference of something that you can't produce in Photoshop. You can't reduce reflection in Photoshop whatsoever. I know you can blend 2 images together and try the best that you can, but it's not going to reduce the reflection like you see right here. So it also impacts your histogram. If I have a bright subject coming into the frame, I'm going to have a spike on the right-hand side of it because I'm going to have more white information there. So if you use certain techniques, there's a certain shooting technique called ETTR, exposed to the right. If I can pack more of my information in a smaller area and push it over to the right as much as possible, I don't have as much, shadow noise because I'm not having to lift that up in post. So again, Polarizer allows you to do that in camera. So in terms of the graduated neutral density filters here, you can see this is the Nisi set that I was talking about earlier. It allows me to slide these filters in front of my lens to compensate for my inability to expose the foreground or the sky at the same exposure, because if I expose for one, the other one's going to be either overexposed or underexposed. It's just inherent. If you've experienced this before. Exposed for the foreground, your sky is going to be blown out. If you expose for the sky, your foreground is going to be dark, and this kind of neutralizes it. It's not perfect by any means, but it does a fairly decent job. And again, this is just me liking to do this in camera. So I'm going to skip, my examples here real quick. We'll talk about histogram for a split second. Just to recap this, all a histogram is just, or at least the luminosity histogram is showing you, your blacks and your whites. That's it. Left-hand side is going to be blacks. The right-hand side is going to be whites. And every variation between black and white is going to be in the middle. So you'll have your blacks, your absolute blacks, your shadows, your midtones, your highlights, as well as your whites. They say a correctly exposed image is going to have all these peaks and valleys within your histogram, within there without any data loss. And, that's not necessarily true. A correctly exposed image is whatever your intention is. And I find that I have a lot of times overexposed parts of my image, typically the sun, And you've seen it before in situations where people try to expose everything correctly. The sun is supposed to be bright, obviously. So having that duplicated in your image is going to make it appear more real. This histogram, all it does is show you like, hey, if I don't intend to have certain areas overexposed, it shows you within that graph, hey, maybe I need to push my exposure back just a little bit, because as we know, the monitor on your screen isn't 100% accurate. It's really dependent on how much backlight you have within that, what brightness level my monitor or my viewfinder is. A lot of times people put it to +5 or the highest level just to see shadow detail. And when you try to get it to print or you bring it back to your computer screen, it's not going to look accurate. Typically, prints aren't back illuminated. You don't have a light behind it. Your screen is generally calibrated, or typically in a darker situation like mine, my contrast and my bright level is typically on the bottom fourth of that. So this histogram helps in aiding you get that correct exposure if you use it correctly. And by correctly, I mean using, when I'm shooting RAW versus JPEG, when you're shooting JPEG, use your histogram, whatever film simulation color profile you use, it's going to be an exact representation of that. If you're shooting RAW, we've all experienced this before. You take your shot in RAW, you bring it over to Lightroom, Capture One, Photoshop, whatever you're using, and typically it looks completely different once it's fully imported because all those JPEG properties are stripped. So what I've been recommending to people, if you do choose to shoot in RAW, shoot in a flat profile, and that way your histogram is going to look closer to what it would look like once you import it to your editing software. And we can kind of see that here. Let me see if I can get this set up where you can actually see my pointer. So even right here, there's a vast difference between these shadowed areas. So this is the exact same image, literally just changed with a different film simulation. So you can see how it does affect your histogram a little bit, especially in my shadows in this particular shot. Shadows versus here in my blue channel versus blue channel, green channel, all these are pushed over just because of the flat simulation. The Velvia profile is very punchy, adds more contrast to my black, so of course I'm going to have more information in the black area on this particular shot. So I'm going to skip techniques real quickly. We talked about flowing water. We talked about starbursts. We talked about hand holding. And if you want to go further in depth to any of this information, TJ and I, we talked 2 weeks ago, and I'm 99% sure that he's sharing this on their YouTube channel, so you can go through it again if you'd like.
Yep, I'm going to put it in the chat as well.
Perfect. So this is where we start our composition, because it all starts with your lens. So for me, I think this is really important for one, how you interact with the subject. Wide angle lenses tend to separate your foreground and your background. It's all based on distance to subject. So a wide angle lens, in order for me to fill the frame, forces me to be right up on top of my subject. And whatever's further away is going to appear much smaller. So as you can see, as I increase my focal length, I'm going to have to back up for once. But when I zoom in, the background's going to appear closer to the foreground. So all this is relative, again, to distance to your subject. When I'm at 280 millimeters, I'm backed up down my driveway. My driveway is over 200 feet long. It's pretty long. So you can still see a little bit of changes, and that's just because this is me taking these shots, in my driveway, just to show you the differences. So with a wide angle lens, I typically am focusing, no pun intended, I'm concentrating on foreground subjects. Typically I'm going to have multiple foreground subjects that I'm going to exaggerate. The way I like to shoot is I like to photograph small objects and make them appear larger within the scene. And I like to use wide angle lenses to isolate those subjects. The best example that I have for the other way around is if I'm using a telephoto lens that generally creates a relationship is, I lived in Colorado for 30 years before I moved out to Ohio for this job. And the great sand dunes are out there. It's a great national park. Highly recommend going. You can actually four-wheel drive on the back side of that. And you can go through these amazing four-wheel drive tracks. Well, unfortunately, I did not have my truck at the time. I was in my Subaru, so I can only go up to a certain point. But there's this amazing tree behind there. And that tree looked fantastic. The glow of the sand dunes really casting that, warmish tone onto the tree. But behind it was, a huge mountain range. There was snow in the mountains. You could actually see it snowing back there, overcast. So, I had my wide angle lens. I got really close to that tree, filled the frame compositionally to the way I wanted it. And, the mountains looked like a peanut in the background. You couldn't even really see them. So, I had the ability to back up, and I backed up maybe 400 or 500 feet. And I took the same shot, but because I backed up, the mountains did look closer to the foreground. So I can create that relationship for compositional purposes. So I know this is a lot of intention, but think of it this way. I find, I can use objects for composition when I'm using wide angle lenses, but because of how flat the field looks sometimes, if you look at the right picture comparative to the left, for me, I find that contrast works a little bit better for me when I'm using telephoto lenses in terms of drawing attention to my focal point, contrast being a bright subject versus a dark subject. And I find that actual subject matter, multiple objects, maybe a repeating pattern, that works better for me when I'm using a wide angle subject. And this is going to be the same for portraits too. If I'm in a situation where I'm photographing a person, it's going to look better, when if I'm using a mid-range lens, just because you're not going to distort your subject, kind of like how my webcam is doing right now. But B, if I have a displeasing background, I just have more control over it. I have the ability to back up, zoom in, I get a tighter shot, and that way I can choose to a better ability what background is going to be showed in my image. And you can use this for landscapes too. Just isolates, your field of view because it's going to be very narrow. So you just have that control. Just keep in mind that depth of field is going to be harder to work with for landscapes. Everyone tries to get everything in focus. And the difference between, 16 millimeter and 280 millimeter, even using the same aperture values, completely different. F16 on a 280 millimeter lens is going to look different than on a 16 millimeter lens. And it just all goes back to how you interact with your subject. So we talked about starting points last time, and I'm just going to go over this real quick before I jump fully into composition, because I think this will be a good refresher. So for landscape shots, starting at the base bones, what aperture value do I choose? Beforehand, I said, choose your aperture value based on your closest subject that you want in focus and your furthest subject that you want to be in focus. That's at least how I choose my aperture value. I'm not just going f16 every single time, because that's not typically where your lens is most sharp, right? Usually a step down below your widest aperture, a lot of times f4, 7.1 is a great spot. That's typically where your lens is most sharp. So for me, I try to be at the lowest aperture possible that allows me to capture everything I want within my depth of field. So a wider angle lens allows you to work with more, like I talked about in the last slide. For this particular shot on the right-hand side, this was shot with a manual lens. I can't remember my aperture value, but it was probably somewhere between f11 and f16. The closest subject with the little flowers in the foreground was probably about 3 or 4 feet from me. And I wanted the background to be blurred out because that wasn't as important as me as showing the relationship between the front log, the back log, and the flowers in between. So a lot of the times I might end up, at higher aperture numbers. It's just inherent, for a lot of times, because I'm so close to my subject, that forces me to use a higher aperture number. So ISO, I always start out in my base, whether it's, 160, whether it's 50, whether it's 200, this is all going to be dependent on what camera you're shooting. Even with within our own Fujifilm, infrastructure, some cameras have 200, some cameras have 160, depending on their sensor technology. So I start off at the base. And the only thing that makes me adjust this is what shutter speed I'm wanting. Do I have any subject movement, being like, say, trees, say, flowers, smaller subjects? If I want to freeze their action, if it's really windy, something along those lines, that would make me adjust my ISO higher than the base. But typically my starting point straight out of the bag is the lowest. Shutter speed is really indicative of, whether I'm tripoding or hand holding. 90% of the time I am on a tripod. That's just my shooting style. I like to show motion within my shots, so I tend to take longer exposures. So tripod wise, again, whatever shutter speed it is, it is. The only thing I'm adjusting for is whether there's movement in my subject. When I'm hand holding, I'm compensating for my movement. A lot of the times I can't hold below a 60th of a second, even on wide angle lenses. But we have this general rule that to compensate for your movement, you want to be at a slightly faster shutter speed than whatever focal length you're using, including the crop factor of your sensor. So if I'm shooting a 300 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, for me in my shooting style, I like to be at least 1/320th of a second. I err on the side of caution. Yes, there's in-body image stabilization. Yes, there's lens stabilization, but I don't care about noise in my image because it just doesn't matter to me anymore. The cameras are good enough. So a wide-angle lens, I can get away with longer focal. I can get away with longer exposures because we've all used binoculars before. You try hand holding a 10-time binocular versus an 8-time, it's just harder. Since my field of view is restricted, any sort of exaggeration to that is going to be extremely obvious in terms of subject movement. Even the tiniest bit is going to be obvious. Same with camera bodies. So white balance, I hear a lot of instructors say, yeah, it doesn't matter. Do whatever you want in post, But for me, in exact color reproduction, I find that I tend to use my white balance, however I want in terms of intention within my shot. Now, the image on the right is a little warm. I actually pushed my white balance to the red a little bit because the film simulation or color profile that I was shooting, I wanted to favor red because that's what I liked. I like the reddish tone. I like the warmish tone. That's just inherent to my shooting style. For a cooler tone, I have that same control. Again, yes, I could do that in Photoshop, but it's just for me. I can look at it while I'm shooting. I can adjust it to whatever I want. And that's going to be even embedded in that EXIF information once you import it to Lightroom, Capture One, Photoshop, whatever you're using. You can recall it or you can change it if you want. And I also use white balance to, change the color, maybe for something completely unnatural. I talk about blue hour, shooting before sunrise, sunset. And typically I lower my white balance to like 2900 Kelvin, 3500 Kelvin, something between that range, which is completely inaccurate, but it tends to make that blue hour appear more purple. So again, I'm using that white balance just to get, whatever tone that I want, warm tone, cool tone, different color cast. And it actually is quite helpful when you're trying to give an overall sense of how the picture feels. So the easiest thing to come from when it comes to composition in landscapes is layer your images. And I'm going to say this 100,000 times. I find that a lot of my students, they have this really great subject matter and they might only have 2 layers to their image. I have a foreground and I have a sky and that's it. For me, in terms of my intention, I like having 3 layers because it adds depth to it. A lot of other things add depth to your image too, height of your tripod, what level you're shooting comparative to the subject, because it gives you the capability of isolating your subject. Like take this shot, for instance. I got really lucky with a lot of aspects of it, and some of it was intentional. This is a real wide angle lens. It's 18 millimeters on a full frame camera. This tree right here, which looks maybe about 2 to 3 feet, is less than a foot. And I'm right up on top of that. I elevated my tripod, so I'm shooting down on the subject. And the reason why I did that is I wanted the contrast difference between my subject and the water behind it. So my subject was bright. I was using a graduated filter here to block out some of the sun. And so the darkness of this area contrasts with the brightness of this. Now, it's not Photoshop or anything. This is almost straight out of camera. But if I shot lower to the ground, it's going to blend in with this because this is closer in terms of exposure-wise than this is to this. So it just makes that tree pop. So the middle ground, that was strictly the rocks there. I had no control over that. But what I did have control over was the spacing on the left-hand side of it, this area right here. My intention was, at least for excluding the sky, was having this draw attention to my focal point here. So very, natural leading line, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. So what I didn't have control over was the clouds. I just got very lucky with this, and it creates this nice little S-curve down here. So if we look at the overall data in terms of the information that I shot, F14, that was because my subject was so close right here. And the main area that I cared about being tack sharp was roughly to about there. So F14 was going to be the right aperture value to choose to get that particular section nice and sharp. For compositional compositional purposes, some people think, hey, I got to get everything tack sharp. With painting, things along those lines, it just doesn't look natural. By the very nature of things further away from you are going to appear softer. So I try to reproduce that within my images. Now, say if I'm shooting a macro shot and it's my intended purpose to get everything close to far, I might stack some of my photos, which allows me to use a lower aperture value. But for 99% of everything that I do, it's all single shot in camera. So my aperture values tend to be a little bit higher. So I'm going to have some areas that are sharp and some that are not. So again, I'm going to be forcing this to you. So foreground in this particular shot is obviously going to be the grass right there. The middle ground and the background is going to be the sky. So, and this might change. I don't necessarily have to have a middle ground be something completely different. It could be a certain area of sky for all that's certain. You can see right here that most of my subjects tend to be on the right side. And that's just how I favor shots. I look at my subject, I flip my image left and right if I'm going to bring it into Photoshop, and I just look at how that interacts with my eye. And for this particular shot, the way the trees are angled made me want to put it on the right-hand side, because if I didn't, this shot is called Sons of Ghosts. And so the large tree, for me, feels like the father of the smaller tree. So the way the tree is leaning is going to be pushing my eye more towards here, because this is a brighter area in terms of contrast with the background and the foreground. So that was my intention. And I tried it the other way, just flipping it around in Photoshop, and it just doesn't feel as natural. For one, it wasn't how it originally appeared within my camera, but for me, it was just leading the eye completely different. So the foreground generally is going to be rooted in something like the ground, but I can have a foreground that's out of focus. It doesn't necessarily need to be sharp, because that will add depth to your image, just like the blurriness of the background in a portrait. I'm not going to have something as muddy. I'm going to be able to isolate my subject from the background if that background is blurred. And that's why you have that control with aperture value. So if you look here, F22, the main reason why I chose that is because this is, 8 or 9 year old image. I wasn't as intuitive in terms of using aperture value correctly. And for me, I was like, I got to use a bright aperture value in order to get the exposure, a high aperture number to get the exposure that I wanted. So for me, if I shot at F16, I would have got a more appropriate image because of how close this is to me. And my furthest point that I wanted in focus was only 30 or 40 feet away from me. Again, it's all trial and error and learning from experience. We all make thousands of mistakes regardless of where we are at photographically. So again, layering background, foreground, middle ground, background. It's a whole bunch of, all these layers can be different things. A lot of people talk about, rule of thirds, rule of thirds, rule of thirds. And so, I could kind of keep that in mind, but you'll notice that instead of having a definitive focal point falling on one of those lines, most of my images are split between 3 sections, and that's where this layering takes place. So you can look on here. This is a very obvious rule of thirds. So this is very obvious in terms of rule of thirds, but as you get more comfortable of where putting your focal point, that'll allow you to break some of these rules. And, there's other compositional tools. You have all these layerings and overlays in Photoshop, golden ratio, the golden spiral, I have so many different things, triangles in Photoshop. I recommend if you ever go to your crop mode, go to the different overlays and see what works best. It gives you such creative freedom because you're not under the restriction of your sensor anymore in terms of aspect ratio. And we'll talk about in the next couple slides, where I find a lot of people, and even me, to be honest, when I was first starting, solely just print in a 2:3 aspect ratio, or 4:3 aspect ratio. They're like, I got to keep it the same, dimension as my sensor in order for it to look good. And that's completely false. Change your aspect ratio in order to fit a composition better with the overlays that you have in Photoshop. Maybe a 4:5 aspect ratio will work better with rule of thirds or golden ratio or golden spiral. Maybe a 1:1, maybe an 8:10, well, that's 4:5, all these different crops will allow you to have more control. And that might force you to, once again, change how you actually photograph your subject. Do I photograph more loosely around my focal point? That allows me to crop in to have more leeway when I lean towards these overlays in order to crop to best fit a situation. So it's just like interacting with your subject when taking a portrait. If I'm photographing my kid, it's so hard to get all that into one shot. I shoot wide. And I shoot, a little bit higher aperture value, so I have more leeway afterwards in post to better fit a composition. And those same rules apply here. So I think for this, if we look at my exposure time, 2.5 seconds, again, all my exposures are going to be this higher number because I use those grad filters that I was talking about, and I'm typically on a tripod. And if you look here in my image, that's blurred. I have motion blur right here, but it doesn't detract from my actual focal point, which is almost right dead in the middle of my image, which you'd think would be a bad thing. But for this, I find that it's fine. This is my focal point right here, and the good contrast with the water around it really makes your eye go to that first, just because it's such a big difference in terms of luminosity value. So we talked about camera height too, and so camera height, the way I recommend it to people is it's totally dependent for me, and this is how I acknowledge it, is how big or how little do I want to represent my focal point. If I want to make my focal point look small, I could photograph down on it. If I want to make it appear large, I photograph up on it. But in terms of camera height for landscapes, for me, this is solely dependent on, do I have foreground detail? Do I have sky detail? So this shot was taken at Pikes Peak. They only open it up 2 days a year for sunrise shots. And to be honest, the sky was pretty boring. I had this nice atmospheric haze right up there with the nice pinkish tone created from my drop-down filter. And so for me, obviously, if I have a boring sky, I'm going to include more foreground. So for me, I try to use that to my advantage. And I'm trying to use natural leading lines that brings attention to my focal point. And again, some of it is just looking around. Take your camera, don't just set up your tripod and say, this is my focal point, this is how I'm going to shoot it. Maybe set up your tripod to where you think you're going to shoot, set up your composition first, then take your camera off your tripod and look at it from different aspects. Maybe you'll find a better composition, and that generally makes you prepare more so when you go out shooting. What are my intentions? Am I just going out for fun, or am I intending to make a print? And am I wanting to capture a subject in a certain light? Do I want to have a busier background, or do I want to have a tighter background or a cleaner background? That'll force you to move left or right, maybe zoom in or zoom out. In this particular shot, there was a whole bunch of rocks right in front of me. And if we actually looked at a high-res image of this, these are really, really sharp. This is sharp, but right after that, it's pretty soft. And for me, that's fine. My main intention was to show these different levels of rocks between that and the background, especially here. This is my focal point within my shot. The way the rocks were actually situated, you know that the sun is coming from the east here. This section is going to be dark. So I'm looking at contrast values between my foreground subject and my actual focal point in this particular shot. So camera height. So this particular shot, I'm shooting up and I'm shooting down on my subject. So let me rephrase that. My tripod is high and I'm photographing down. And the reason why is I wanted to capture this space between this rock and this rock. And so there was water in between it. And if I chose, to shoot lower, this would have blended in with this. So, I'm using that for separational purposes. So I knew, and we generally know, if I'm taking a long exposure of water, it tends to look frothy, and that frothy water tends to look white. these rocks are so dark, I wanted to use that water in conjunction with that to basically draw attention to what my focal point is, which is generally these rocks right here. So you can see, compositionally looking at it in terms of like foreground, middle ground, and background, I have my foreground here, my middle ground here, and my background's the sky. And I have more foreground. Even though the sky has some drama to it, there wasn't much going on beyond the clouds in terms of this point up here. It was very much just a solid piece, so I excluded that from my actual image. So not a lot of people realize that, contrasts could be more than just, brightness or colors. I could either find a relationship or I could find something completely different. So for me, I try to look for repeating patterns sometimes within my image, and that'll force me to shoot a particular way. So we talked about starburst beforehand. I choose a higher aperture number, basically stopping down, maybe f14 and higher, allows me to make a pinpoint of light into a star. And so I wanted that to mirror my subject, which is this yucca plant. So I can use these photograph tools that we learned from my last class in order to create a repeating shape. And so for me, I'm creating this relationship between the foreground and the background by using those tools, in this aspect, technical tools, as well as compositional tools. And I'm also using contrast difference in terms of brightness in two areas. And some of it is just natural. I didn't have control over it. But, I could have easily brought my camera's height down just a little bit, got less of the sky, and I would have got more of this bright gold in terms of this grass here, right here. And I would only had a sliver of black there for contrast. And, for me, compositionally, the way it was, it just didn't work out right. It just didn't look good. A lot of times you'll feel that, this doesn't feel like it should. And, the reason why is because I would have a foreground that was too close to what my middle ground would actually look like. And that was the reason why I ended up cutting that off. The only reason why there's this little spot right here is just because it was there. I had no control over that. And of course, you're not going to get rid of that in your image. You don't want to be that person that, destroys Mother Nature just to get a compositional shot. And unfortunately, there are those people out there. Another way to kind of have an idea, this is going further beyond the repeating patterns, is that look at the way your focal point is leaning, and that might help you dictate where you place it within your shot. Meaning that if I look at this yucca plant, look how these sticks are bending. If I push that over to the right-hand side, even though I favor the right-hand side for most of my shooting, I don't know why, I just put it there. The way those are bending, it would have led my eye outside of the frame. And so, your goal is to keep the viewer in. So a couple ways you can do that, using your subjects, using brightness in terms of vignetting. This particular shot, I did add a little bit of vignette to it to keep the eye within. And that subject information in terms of how it's interacting with your focal point or whether it is your focal point. If you have something that's going to be tilting outside of the frame, again, it just doesn't feel natural, and generally the eye will lead outside of that. So keep that in mind. So leading lines, I know we hear that a lot, either natural or man-made, people-made in this aspect. So I try to look for a lot of naturally made leading lines, and it doesn't always work for me, but most of the time when I'm at least intended to shoot it that way, it works well. So if we look at here, I have two definitive focal points. I have the sun in the background, as well as this little piece of twig in the foreground, which is roughly only like 6 inches, just because I'm shooting so wide. So for this, I'm trying to create a relationship between the two with that nice leading line. And it's the same kind of style as I go back in this first shot that I showed you. 2 more slides, I promise. The same thing. I'm using these natural leading lines. We're going to exclude this because I didn't have control over that, but I had control over where I positioned this. So lead your viewer is basically what I'm getting at. Let me go back to this last slide. So You also have, made leading lines. A lot of times this can be your fence posts, things along those lines. Fence post, either in this instance, directly here, it could be a highway if you're photographing down it to the sun coming up over the horizon line. Use these objects and you'll see them. Just look, the way I start off with is I look for my focal point, then I look around said focal point, and this determines where I will actually put my camera. Is there anything leading up to that? So if I'm photographing in this particular shot more so to the left of the frame, I could have still got this into it, but it didn't feel as natural. I didn't have as much of a presence of the fence in this aspect, and I used that fence for my foreground. So that's how I split this particular shot between my foreground, my middle ground being the trees where my focal point is set up, and the sky being my background. So also, and I tend to use this a little less often. I've been notoriously told that I have a lot of information within my shots. Sometimes you can use subjects to frame your focal point, or sometimes you can use negative space to frame your focal point. So this picture on the left is a really old shot in Colorado. I have the nice sunset, even though I am, pointed south on this particular shot, and I'm using the trees on both sides to basically hold that into place. If I was more experienced photographically, I might have shot a vertical shot of this, backed up and zoomed in a little bit, and maybe it made this tree look a little bit taller, and that might have got rid of this space right here to keep the eye in. So for this particular shot, you can see foreground, middle ground is going to be this tree, and the sky is going to be up top. It was a really beautiful sunset that day. So you'll find that a lot of my shots are from Colorado. So the image on this right here, so again, I'm using negative space to draw attention to my subject as well as contrast, the white from the black area in this particular shot. I shot at the sand dunes a whole bunch. The tree shot that I was talking to you about first, we were talking about choosing a lens for compositional purposes in terms of relationship between the foreground and the background. This is like, I got so excited about that shot. I'm like, I'm going to go next week and do the exact same thing. And didn't happen. It was literally a dust everywhere. I wasn't going to get a good background no matter what. So for me, I use that to my advantage in terms of looking for a subject that's isolated and drawing attention to it using that contrast. And, I could have had more foreground, but my foreground was all muddled with the exact same thing that you saw here. It was just a whole bunch of these bushes that really didn't do anything in terms of contrast. It actually diluted this particular tree because there's more mid-tone values. So for this, I wanted a brighter value comparative to the tree, and that's why I included the sky. So for this, I went against the rules of having a middle ground. There's strictly a foreground, and my background, my middle ground, and my background are strictly sky, and that's okay. You can break whatever rule you want. A lot of times it's how it feels, and you're going to feel that intuitively. I know a lot of people try to learn techniques, and most instructors just say it felt that way, and you'll understand that too as you continue to shoot more and more. And a lot of the times it's just, how does the image feel to you in terms of your relationship between the foreground, middle ground, and background? Again, I know I repeated a whole bunch. So contrast is something that I say a whole bunch. And, we're talking about camera height a little bit beforehand. It completely changes, how your focal point is perceived, in terms of how much does it make it pop. In this particular shot, this was taken in Iceland. If I raised my camera height, I'm so low to the ground on this one, I would have got a very messy background. Right behind this lighthouse is a building. There's a little bit of a ridge here, so I photographed low to the ground, low as possible. So to get rid of that building, I could no longer see it behind the actual lighthouse. Also, it helped me fill that frame in. So fill the frame of the foreground. So we look right here, I've got two focal points in this particular shot. one right here, which is placed on a third of my frame, and one right here that's placed on a third of my frame. But the brightness of that lighthouse really works in terms of making it pop because it's a completely different contrast level than the blue of the sky back there. So just moving your camera height can just make that focal point so isolated that your eye has no choice but to go to it. And a quick tip in order to find that brightest point in this particular shot and finding bright points of within a shot is just squint your eyes a little bit. You know, it makes everything really soft and you can see what's brightest. I mean, it might seem obvious, whatever bright's bright, but sometimes it works a little bit better when it's just a blob, you know, a blob meaning completely out of focus. So we talked about motion in terms of showing motion within my shots. And, you know, I do this quite a bit. That's pretty much my favorite thing to do, to be honest, because it adds an extra dynamic to it. So this particular shot, I relied on something man-made in order to create motion with my image because it just wasn't there. I took the shot originally, you know, it was a really foggy day. You know, I wanted to capture kind of a gloomy, kind of lonely road. And I couldn't do that with nothing else in the frame other than the trees and the road. It wasn't interesting. It looked nice, kind of captured the essence of the shot. But for me, I wanted to show motion. And by this, I took a longer exposure. And so the man-made subject was just a car driving by. And for me, it adds almost a ethereal feel. So it almost looks like a ghost traveling into the frame, or that's at least how I intended it to be. So, and that adds to the eeriness and the gloominess of it. And so once again, foreground, middle ground, and background. In this particular shot, foreground is right here, middle ground is right here, and the luminosity difference is up here. Luminosity difference, you know, this is slightly brighter than the dark areas right here. That'll section that off and create that third layer. You can see where my focal point actually was in terms of contrast. You know, this is a lot darker than here, which is my intended focal point, which is still within that third area. So you can see kind of a repeating pattern here of, you know, I'm putting my subject, and it can be in the upper portion of the frame or the lower portion. I favor the lower portion because I tend to include a lot of sky. Or in this particular shot, these trees were pretty tall, so it just wouldn't feel natural if I had less trees and more road. Here's another example of motion, and I kind of had two pieces of motion here. So I was out with Zach from the Pixel Connection. We were just shooting kind of preparation on one of our, you know, photo trips, and there was this great kind of starburst in the back to it. I wouldn't call it starburst. God rays is what a lot of people calls it, but I didn't really have anything interesting beyond that. So I'm trying to create something that, you know, repeats in this particular shot. Repeats means I wanted this God ray to mirror up something that in the foreground. So I've experimented with my shutter speeds in order to see what was the shutter speed that I needed in order to get my focal point, which now is the car in front of it, to look so much like the background in this particular shot, which are those God rays. And kind of the streaks of lines kind of emulated that. So I'm using those, you know, quote unquote man-made, you know, subjects in order to create, you know, a dynamic motion within my image. So again, like I talked about beforehand, you know, the easiest way to show motion in your image is water. And that's why I tend to favor it. Just not that I'm lazy, it's just that for whatever reason, I find that I have the most fun out of landscape photography when I'm shooting a subject like this. And we talked about it beforehand in my last class. You know, my exposure time is going to be totally dependent on how fast the water is moving. You know, the faster the water is moving, the shorter of the exposure I can take to get that frothy like water. In this particular shot, I had to take a fairly short exposure, and the reason why is this water was moving so fast in this particular shot. And if I took a longer exposure, it was so blurry that I lost any contrast value between this right here and the water itself. It just didn't do anything for me. And again, this is all experimentation, and it's ultimately what you want to do. And so if your purpose is to freeze the action of the water to show how choppy it was, use a short exposure. If you want to create motion within your image, use a longer exposure. But you'll try, as you try different exposure times in order to get the shot that you want. And again, you're using ISO in order to change this because you don't want to change your aperture value. You'll see what the appropriate amount of motion blur is going to be for your shot. So if I took a 10-second exposure on this, there would be no definitive detail back here. And for me, that just doesn't feel right. I wanted the texture of that water to look close to the texture of this rock. These are all jaggedy right here. So again, it's all about just looking at it and looking at what feels right to you. So uninteresting sunset happens all the time. Trust me, I know. So this shot was created by taking a long exposure. So I was able to use a dead tree that didn't move very much. If I had any sort of leaves, they'd be all blurred out. And I can take this long exposure and I can create depth within my image based on how the clouds are moving. So I recommend when you're taking shots like this, take a second and just look and see how the clouds are traveling, because it's going to work against you. Say in this shot, if the clouds were moving left and right, compositionally, it just didn't feel the same. It felt, I can't really describe how it felt other than it didn't feel right. So for me, I looked at, hey, where are the clouds actually moving? And that sets me up in terms of where I'm going to position my camera. Because when the clouds move toward you, away from you, for me, that adds depth to it because it feels like I'm falling into it, if that makes sense. So I'm almost to the end of this, and we kind of dabbled on it beforehand. I think this is really important. A lot of people, not so much nowadays, beforehand when we were reprinted more, which I highly recommend you do anyway, because you'll fall in love with your landscape photography all over again. Back then we were really stuck into the composition of what our sensors were, 4:5, 4:3, 2:3 aspect ratio. And we didn't diverge from that too often. I highly recommend for compositional purposes, break away from, the constraints of your sensor, whatever it is. For this particular shot, this was shot at a 4:3 aspect ratio because that was the dimension of the sensor. And for compositional purposes, it just worked better as a 16:9 aspect ratio. My definitive foreground here, my middle ground right here, and my background of this particular shot. And so you can use whatever constraint that you want. And if you're worried about framing it, mats are cheap. Get a frame size that's close to whatever dimension it is. I mean, heck, you can build your own frames by just metal pieces that they have at any of these hobby places, or most camera stores nowadays, they'll have the ability to direct you to a place that frames, or they even frame themselves. And so for me, I don't worry about that anymore. And it gets much more liberal in terms of using just my compositional tools on Photoshop if I'm using that to crop. Again, we talked about that overlay in depth. Use it to your advantage. So again, in this particular shot, I generally shot a 2:3 aspect ratio. And for me, it just didn't feel right. And so I had so much wasted space. My focal point was going to be, this little leaf right here. And, I was like, the sun looks really great. My background wasn't that interesting. So I put it in the middle of the frame too. And when I was looking at it, I'm like, there's so much dead space. Now I just use, my different aspect ratios to lose anything within my frame that's not added into it. So that's easily done by, you take your shot, and I recommend go through your older images and even do this. Take your shot, put it up on even if it's something that you're proud of, put it up on the screen, and just either use your object tool to create a black just spot and move that around, or just use your hand. And so put your hand over your shot and see, does this add to my composition, or does it take away from my composition? And that'll allow you to kind of get a general idea of what aspect ratio you should use in that instance. And so for this particular shot, so much dead space, the 1:1 aspect ratio was the best for this particular situation. So This is kind of wrapping up now. I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me to present the second half of the landscape tutorial. I know composition is, very liquid in the sense of how people approach it, and everyone's going to tell you something differently. But, consistent things that people talk about in terms of composition, a lot of people say rule of thirds. If you haven't heard of golden ratio, golden spiral, the triangles, I recommend that you look into that. Maybe your brain will work better with those that compositional overlay versus the rule of thirds. I found that compositionally, I work better on a more square format than a long format. If you have the capability, shoot a little bit wider, leaving space within your composition allows you to go to a 4:3 aspect ratio. Maybe that's better for you, or maybe a 1:1. So a lot of the times, even contrast, that's fairly consistent that, people talk about in terms of, taking a picture of a landscape. Maybe contrast is what level your tripod is. My tripod height determines, my relationship to the subject. If I photograph low and I have a really boring sky, I could have a subject that's relatively dark and that sky is bright, and that contrast just makes it pop. So once again, I just want to thank Pixel Connection for having me on there.
Yeah, and we really appreciate all of the knowledge. There were so many tips, just little things that were even peppered in throughout that I was taking notes in my note-taking app, just because it's stuff that you think of, but it's like you always forget. You know what I mean? And I jotted those down as a reminder. So thank you so much to Chris. What questions do we have, guys? I want to know what questions you guys have about landscape photography or Fuji in general. We definitely want to get those questions answered for you. So while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I wanted to let you guys know that we are still open at the store from 10 to 7 Monday through Friday and 10 to 5 on Saturday. And we have curbside pickup, we have shipping, and the store is open as well. Feel free to take advantage of any of those options. Don't think that you have to come in the store, if you don't feel comfortable. You can absolutely take advantage of our curbside pickup. Also, if there's something that you want to see on future live streams, please reach out and let me know. I want to make sure that I am answering questions that you have. If it's something, maybe you want to talk about business, or maybe you want to talk about, the special ways to photograph llamas at night, what that might be, just let me know what it is that we can do for you. That's what we're here for. We're here for you guys, supporting creators. And we do this every day at noon.
How many llamas do you have?
I have a lot of stuffed llamas, an alarming number of stuffed llamas, but no real ones yet.
You can pay $100 for a llama to appear on your Zoom call, right?
Oh,
that is a real thing. I'm not kidding.
They are genius. I would totally send me that link. Fun. So I want to let you know, if you do come in the store, kind of what to expect. Number one, we have been disinfecting everything multiple times a day. We clean, like if you try a new camera, let's say you're checking out that new X100V, we wipe it down after every single use. We wipe them out when we put them away at night and when we put them out in the morning. We're making sure everything is super clean. We also ask that you abide by the social distancing rules and regulations. So please, if you have your mask, wear it in the store. And then also please maintain a 6-foot distance. We want to make sure that we are doing our part to get over this thing and get back to kind of a little more normal. So I want to let you know, a little bit. Yep. I want to let you know that we did publish a new episode of the Talking Pixels podcast with Justin and I, and we did talk about pricing. So if you're wondering about how to price your work, if you're just getting started, or just a little bit of a refresher, it's about a 45-minute audio podcast just about pricing. So go ahead and check that out. If you're looking at where to find that, you can go to social.thepixelconnection.com and you'll find the link for the podcast there. I also want to let you know that we are still moving forward with the Pixel Photo Fest, August 14th through 16th. We have already announced a ton of awesome speakers, especially Brian Manier there, Fuji landscape top-notch guy, but all of these speakers are the top in their industry. So if you want to save $100 on that conference, you can use code Lunch and Learn, and that'll allow you to save $100, which brings your entry down to $99. Guys, you won't be able to get a better photographic education and just good time than Pixel Photo Fest, and that's going to be in downtown Cleveland. Speaking of downtown, this shot was downtown of Newark. That is that was from my hotel window overlooking the Panasonic headquarters there. And This week's theme is long exposure. So if you have a cityscape that has long exposures, waterfall, star trails, whatever it is, anything that's showing kind of that motion, then you can enter the weekly contest. And again, it's an easy way to win a $50 gift card. All you have to do is follow us on Instagram at the.pixel.connection and share your entry with hashtag the Pixel Connection and hashtag Pixel Long Expo. That lets me know which image you're entering into the contest for this week. I also want to let you know we still have a few days with the 10% off Tether Tool savings. So again, that's marked down on the website. So all you have to do is go on purchase and you can save 10% off all Tether Tools products. I also want to let you know that we are working with Sigma to raise money for local food banks. So 5% of your lens purchase goes directly to the Cleveland Food Bank to help local families in need. Sounds like somebody's in need. If you're of a one-on-one, please let us know. We have these set up, so if you need help with live stream, you need help with landscape photography, street photography, travel, whatever it is, or you just want to learn a little bit more about your camera, you can reach out and set up a virtual one-on-one where we can help you just like this, except the other 20-some people aren't here. It's just you and I, and we talk about the problems that you have about your camera. I'm not certified for life problems, I'm sorry, but if you have camera problems, then you can set up a one-on-one, and we'll be able to help you out. I also want to let you know kind of what's going on the rest of the week. The next 2 days, we are in Sigma land. We are still working out some finite details with those, so that programming might be subject to change. But I promise if you show up tomorrow, we're still doing a live stream, and it's going to be epic. So join us for the rest of the week. And then, guys, Thursday, Joel Grimes is going to be on. It's going to be kind of an inspirational / get off your butt and, get back to working hard and get over this pandemic and start killing it and crushing it as far as your business and kind of growing from here. So if you guys have absolutely any questions, feel free to reach out. Melissa says, thank you so much for the lunch and learns. Absolutely. And then a couple people did come in. Hopefully they're still here. I wanted to kind of put their name up on the screen. We have Karna. Hello, Karna. We have Jen on here. We have Dominic. We have my friend Tech Gear Talk. He says, what is up, TJ and Chris? And Jason says, nice photo. I don't remember which one that was on, but they were all great photos, Chris. And then also Melissa says, thank you so much for these lunch and learns. Absolutely. I'm glad that you guys are getting something out of them. So again, thank you so much to Chris for joining us today.
Thank you, TJ.
My friend. And if anybody needs absolutely anything, please feel free to reach out. We'll see you guys later and have a good week.